Welcome all, Richie Owens from markmeldrum.com here with a quick video for no apparent reason in the current climate on tariffs. Why tariffs? Well, in actual fact, we get a lot of questions, and this is a kind of roundabout way of explaining it, but we get a lot of questions about the pre-reads in level 1 versus what's in the actual curriculum. I'm going to use this as an example of how you should look at the difference between the two. The pre-reads do have LOSs. They're not directly examinable, though. It is brought forward information that you should then be able to apply in the main reading. And we can, as I say, use tariffs as an example. So here we go. Classic diagram. We have domestic supply and domestic demand. Ignoring the outside world, we would therefore have a beautiful equilibrium right about here. But the outside world exists, and we're getting imports. And as such, the world price, so obviously there are producers overseas who can produce cheaper than we can domestically. Given those producers, the world price is down here with that dashed blue line, which means we have here the quantity supplied domestically. That's all our domestic suppliers are willing to supply at that world price. But given how cheap it is, our domestic consumers are lapping it up, and we have consumption there. Obviously, there is a gap. That gap is your imports and represents, though, potentially a huge amount of imports and certainly part of your potentially trade deficit. So if you do want to reduce your trade deficit, if that is your aim, you may engage in protectionism and put in place a tariff. What is a tariff? And this is the main point I want to make today. We often say, try and apply the CFA concepts to the real world. Look at what's going on in the real world. That can be dangerous with economics if you put economic terminology in the hands of people who are less than capable of dealing with it. If you introduce tariffs, what you're doing is putting a tax on importers. Importers are in your own country. They are domestic. They have to pay a tariff on goods that are imported. You are not taxing overseas entities. Let's use a random example of Chinese auto manufacturers. If you put a tariff on cars coming into the US, it will be importers who pay the tariff. What will that do? And before you shout at the screen, I will caveat this in a minute. But typically what that will do is increase the price. Once you add in the tariff, the price increases. So domestic producers are willing to supply more, but domestic consumers are willing to consume less. We therefore get this gap and a smaller amount of imports. So yes, there is a smaller level of imports, which may help your trade deficit if that's what you're looking for. But be aware, importers are paying the tariff and consumers, as a result of the tariff, are typically, and there's that caveat again, typically paying a higher price. Now, why do I keep saying caveats and typically? Well, if you are a large enough country, there is an argument that, look, your market is so important to these overseas countries that they may actually drop the price in order to keep exporting to your country. So in that sense, you maybe can affect the world price and reduce the impact of the tariff and reduce this increase in price to your domestic consumers. But it certainly isn't going to make them better off. I think I've stressed that point highly enough. As I say, one other thing I want to mention is the link between pre-reads and the main readings. One of the big things here, if we assume that you are not a large enough country to influence the world price, and indeed the diagram we're looking at is what happens. Once the price has gone up, you have hurt domestic consumers. And the way it's explained in the main economics reading in CFA Level 1 is that you are reducing consumer surplus. And that term, consumer surplus, is a pre-read term. So you might look at it in the main reading and think, I don't know what consumer surplus is. What are you talking about? This doesn't help me understand the impact of tariffs. Well, let me tell you, consumer surplus is the difference between what somebody is willing to pay and what they pay. If you look at the original world price here, this is where we ended up in terms of domestic consumption. There were people who'd be willing to pay this price up here. They only have to pay this price. So there is a big surplus. Same here and all the way along. And in fact, that entire area underneath the demand curve, but above the world price, that big triangle, is your consumer surplus. Lots of people get to buy for less than they were willing to pay. Now, what happens if we introduce the tariff and the price does rise? Well, once the price has risen, the consumer surplus is now this area here, this triangle, instead of the big blue area. So what we've lost is this area here. This entire area shaded in red is the consumer surplus that we've lost. Now, where does it go, you might say? Well, not all of it disappears entirely. This area here that I'm now cross-hatching, that is an increase in producer surplus. Just like there's a term consumer surplus, there's also a producer surplus. Being able to sell for a price higher than you're willing to supply at. So that area, okay, it's lost from consumers, it goes to producers. This area in the middle, which now represents our continuing level of imports. Well, that is your tariff revenue. That the government can pocket. But nobody gets these two triangles. This area here, that is just lost into the ether. That is a dead weight loss. So hopefully a useful little explanation of pre-reads versus main readings in level 1. My approach would be to start with the main readings, and if you start to see terminology you don't understand, go back to the pre-reads then. But don't start with the pre-reads, otherwise you'll be reading stuff, at least to some extent, that you already know. And secondly, just to clear up what a tariff is and who pays the tariff.